User interfaces are a critical part of the player's experience. They're how players see what's happening and how they interact with the systems that you choose to expose, whether that's checking health, crafting an item, or navigating a menu. A good UI communicates clearly, it feels consistent, and it helps players focus on the game instead of fighting the controls. The best UIs almost disappear. They give players the information they need at the right time and without overwhelming them. In this lesson, we're going to explore how Godot's UI system makes that possible. You'll see how reusable scenes can be combined to build a responsive interface that looks good at any screen resolution. But a static UI is only half the story. So in this final lesson, we're going to bring everything together that you've learned to connect the interface to player actions and populate it with real game data. Now, this starter project comes with a few new things, so you're going to want to make sure to grab it off the GitHub repo. So first, there are several new sprites that we have included, which we're going to work with as we set up the UI. There's also an oven, which the player can walk up to and interact with, and that's how we're going to end up calling the UI to show up. And then I have made one UI row called ingredient. So that being said, let's make the first part of this project, which is the UI. Go to new scene and then pick user interface. Now you can see here that the type of top level node is different. It's a control node, and control nodes work a little differently from 3D nodes that you've been using. So while 3D nodes exist in world space with X, Y, and Z coordinates, control nodes exist in screen space with only X and Y coordinates. And if we add another node, you'll see, just like before, there are many control nodes that you can choose from. Some are even nested. So container nodes, as an example, are going to help you handle complex layout tasks. And you're going to use a lot of these to slowly build up whatever it is that you're trying to create. So for what we're doing right now, let's start by adding the background, which we're going to use a texture rect for. And actually, before we even do that, we do need to fix the layout here. So right now, this control node is set to the full screen, which sometimes is great, but for our case, we want to set the anchor to be centered. You can see now we have kind of this X in the middle of the screen. Anchors define how a control will reposition itself relative to its parent. So we want this UI to always be center relative to, well, the screen in this case. Now, if we come back over to texture rect, let's call this the background. And actually, we need to set the texture, which, as you can see, is quite big, but that's okay. We're going to fix that. The first thing that we will do is change this to fixed width proportional. And then let's change its layout size. Here, it'll be 338 and then 386. Now you can see the top parent is center screen, but this is actually positioned, it looks like top left, and we want this to also be centered screen. So we'll change the layout mode to anchors and then pick centered, and now everything is where it should be. We'll save this. We'll call it, whoops, Workbench. Probably should have called that Workbench UI, but that's okay. Now we're going to add a child to this, which is going to be a margin container. Now, margin containers add consistent padding around its child controls. So this is perfect for keeping UI elements from touching the edges of the screen, or in our case, the edges of the background panel, which we don't want to have happen. We will call this bounds margin. And then once again, we're going to do layout, position, anchors. But we're actually going to set this one to be full rect. We want this to just follow the size of its parent. And then under theme overrides, which this section, by the way, will change depending on what you are working with. And in this case, we have margins. So we're going to set the margins here. Let's see, right and left. Let's go 20. And then I'm going to bring the top and the bottom in a little more. It's going to be inconsistent. That'll be okay. I just want it to come down a little. And that's it. Save again. Now I want to add a vertical box container or VB box container as a child. Now this one will automatically stack its child controls vertically, one after another, and then it handles spacing for you as well, which is really handy. We'll call this bounds vertical. And then we're going to add one more as a child of that, and this will be our content. So hopefully you can see what I mean in terms of you end up adding a lot of these container nodes to build up towards whatever the look and feel is that you want. So with this content one, we're going to set the layout, container sizing, and on the horizontal, we're going to do shrink center. For the vertical, we're going to leave it fill, but we'll check expand. And then underneath this, we're going to add another, but this is going to be an HBox container. And this is going to be called title row. Now the HBox container does exactly what the vertical box container does, except for now we're going horizontal. And we'll add a little bit more so you can actually see now what's going on. So to start, let's do another texture, rect. And we'll call this actually title icon. And then we'll call this, or we'll set the texture to chicken cooked. And for this, under expand mode, we'll do ignore size. We want to set the size. And then under stretch, we'll say keep aspect. So we don't want it to stretch funny. And then under layout, we'll do custom min size is a 32 by 32. Okay, so now under row, let's add another one. And this is going to be a label. This will be basically our header. We'll call it title label though. And then under this, we'll say cook chicken. So under theme overrides, there's lots of different properties because we're interacting with a label. And in this case, we're going to change the font color. And we'll make this, let's see, what did I want? 8CB7C8. No, I did not have that memorized. And then font size, oops, not that, font size. We're going to make this 25. Hopefully you can kind of tell here, title row, we're going that way. Let's actually move this to be a child of content. And now you can see it's going to stack, as I mentioned, vertically. And it handles all of that positioning for us, which is just so handy. So now that that's done, we're going to add the next thing under there, which is going to be another margin container. And this is actually our divider. It's just going to make it look all nice. And underneath it, we'll add a panel. Actually, let's call this container, divider container, and then we're going to call this divider. So under layout for this, we're going to set this to 3. And then theme overrides here, we want to set the margin. We're going to do the top and the bottom. And this will be 10, just to give a little space between. And then the divider is going to be the actual, I guess, line that separates the two. So with this, we can pick the style box flat. There we go. Well, we're going to set the color here to be 223C57. Like a light blue. It's actually not quite. There we go. And I did want to set the radius here. We'll do this as a 3, give it a little bit of a rounded edge. There we go. All right, so then we have an ingredient header that we want to add. This will be a label. And then we'll set the text property to requires. We're going to match the font color here. So I'm just going to come over here, copy that so you don't have to watch me type it out again. And where are you? Theme overrides, colors. And then let's set the font size here to 20 pixels, just to be a little bigger.
All right, we're almost done with this section. So what we want to do here is add buttons, and we're going to add a container as a child of bounds vertical. And this will be our center container. A center container will make its children center both horizontally and vertically, which is great for kind of spacing out our buttons. We'll call this buttons. And then we'll add a hfox container because we want these to go horizontally. We'll call it buttons row. And then let's space these out. We'll space them out by 15. This is a good place to pause for a moment and talk about what the buttons are that we're going to add and how we're going to impact the way that they look. So there will be 2 buttons, cook and close. And typically when you have a button, you want to have a different visual representation depending on the state. So you'll have how they look normally, how they look when hovered, and how they look when clicked. Now, instead of using separate images, what we have here is, there we are, is a single image that represents the 3 states that I've just mentioned. This is a pretty common practice. You typically want to pack your sprites into a single sheet because it's a lot more performant than having a bunch of individualized sprites. So I wanted to kind of show you how you could do the individual thing. Now we're going to explore how you can pull a single sprite out of a texture that has multiples. So coming back over to buttons row, let's add a new child node, and oh, it's right there. We're going to add a button. Oops, needs to be there. And we'll name this button cook. And we'll set the text property to cook. And then under layout, there you are. We're going to set the minimum size here to be 75 by 30. All right, so now let's configure the buttons atlas. And this, again, will be under the theme overrides and styles. So you can see there's actually several different ones that you can change. But like I said, we're going to focus on really just 3. We'll do new style box texture. And then under texture, we're going to set this to an atlas texture. And then click that to expand it. And now we'll drop this in here. And then under region, we'll do edit region. And zoom in a bit here. Now you can choose auto slice, and it'll change these blue boxes to be where it thinks the images are. You can manually do this if it gets it wrong. Now we'll pick the first sprite and then hit close. And then coming back to, whoops, and to close that. Coming back to this, let's set the texture margins to 7. Okay, now we repeat that same process for the other states. So hover. And then we set it once again to atlas texture. And then button sprite, the regions, and we'll pick the second one. And then again, the margins set to 7. And we can close that. And then the, oh, pressed. Texture. Then at this. Once again, just drop the image. Edit region. Select that. Texture margin 7777. All right, there we go. Now, instead of doing that for the second button, we can just copy this one. Now as a child. There we go. And rename this button close. Okay, so this feels like a good place to pause and drop this in to see what we've just built. So if we look for it, make it child of the scene. All right, you can see if you click, nothing happens. But actually, if you do click, there's that border. I don't like that border. So let's get rid of that real fast. So So if we come back over to this button, it's going to be, let's see here. That is actually not on pressed. That is focus. And we're going to say new style box empty. I just don't want anything to show up. So the same thing here, we'll go to overrides, styles, focus, and we'll make it an empty box. Save. I think we're still in the scene, right? Yep. Okay, no white box. And before we jump into the code side, let's look at what it is that we're actually going to be creating. And the end goal here is to have you walk through instantiating a UI component dynamically in code and then populating it with information, since this is a very common use case that you're going to encounter. So as I mentioned before, I created an ingredient row, and where this is going to get instantiated is within the content section. And we're actually going to do 2. So it'll look something like this. And the ingredient is going to shift in terms of the text that you see in the icon, depending on what information that we supply it with. Right now, it's just chicken uncooked and milk, so it'll stay the same on one of them. Okay, let's get rid of these and let's add a new script. We'll call this Workbench User Interface. And put this again under the scripts folder. Great. Okay, so before we jump in, it's worth noting that Workbench comes with a script. And this script is essentially a mirror of the chicken station in terms of how it works. The player walks up, they press E, and the Workbench will emit a signal, which in this case is Workbench interaction. And we're going to update the Workbench user interface to populate the ingredients, subscribe to that signal, and then handle showing and hiding itself. So if we add the code in here, actually let me zoom in a little bit, make that easier to see. Okay, so up at the top, we have our references. The craft button and close button are just references to those buttons. And then content container is the section that I mentioned earlier we were going to add the ingredient rows to. Workbench is a reference to the Workbench so that we can get a subscription to the signal. Now within Ready, 5 things, I guess technically, are happening. The first is it's hiding itself. And that hide and actually show, which is down below, are methods that are available because this is inheriting from control. So the next thing that's happening is it's going to set up the ingredients, which to start, it's loading the scene as a template. Now, technically, we could add this as a reference, but I thought this was a good opportunity to show how you can load resources through code. And the next thing that it's doing is it's looping through the strings, which in this case, we're doing 2 ingredients, milk and chicken, and it's instantiating them. Then it's taking content container and it's adding this as a child to it so that it's in the hierarchy where we need it to be. The last thing that's happening is it's calling setup on the ingredient class, which is another class that's provided on the starter project. This isn't really doing anything fancy. All it's doing is it's setting the name of the ingredient to the string that we pulled out of the array, and it's looking up in the dictionary for the correct texture. So next, for the on Workbench interacted, which is triggering when that signal is emitted, we're showing the window. And then when the close button is pressed, we're hiding it. Lastly, when the craft button is pressed, we're just doing a print saying that it's been pressed. And that's it. Okay, so let's pop into Godot, and we need to refresh the inspector so that we can set the variables. And we'll assign these buttons. So close, cook, I guess I started calling that craft at some point. Workbench we're skip because we're going to get that in the scene. But content will be this one. We'll go ahead and save that. And then for other references, we can pull in the oven or Workbench. I'm very consistent in names today, apparently. And then hit save, push play, walk up, push E. Oh, let's click cook, close, and that's it.
Before we wrap up, remember, great UIs aren't about showing everything. They're about showing the right things at the right time in the clearest way possible. If players can instantly understand what's happening and what they can do, the UI is doing its job. Build your interfaces from small, reusable pieces, rely on layouts instead of manual placement, and always test them from the player's perspective. For your challenge, take these ideas further by creating a simple inventory. Lay out a grid of slots, let the player click to select an item, and wire it up so details appear when they interact. It doesn't need to be flashy. The goal is to practice turning static layout into something dynamic and responsive.